everything I've written here because it's a little, I don't want to take too much of the time. I think you told me 20 minutes, right? Or is it too long?
No, you can take as long as you need to.
Yeah. Because I'm getting into this, it's part of a very...
Can I record?
Yeah. It's part of a very broad discussion. And let me say a little bit about myself. I grew up very poor in the northeastern part of Nigeria. And when I came to this country, I never thought I would be able to make it here, but I applied to about 60 universities, telling them what I wanted to do or whatever, and just put them in the mail. And then a response to one of those letters was what made it possible for me to come to the University of Minnesota. And I was given the MacArthur Foundation Fellowship for International Studies and Promotion of Peace and International Cooperation. So at this point in my career, I feel really very ambivalent. Part of me feels like I will die a frustrated person because when I was young, I had much more hope in what Africa would become. And right now, I feel like for some time, I thought I would be able to go back to retire there and maybe help people at the end. But now it's no more possible for me to do that because of the way the country has become so confused in Nigeria, for instance. And it's something that I feel very painful because when I went to the university, my goal was to use education for national development or contribute to community development. Yes, I want to develop myself, but I wasn't going to feel satisfied just taking care of myself without taking care of the whole, contributing something to the whole community. And then here am I now in my late 50s, and I realize that Nigeria has become something totally different from, and there is no day I don't feel concerned about that. And it's not just Nigeria. There are many African countries, you will agree with me, that are going through the same kind of thing. So, but when I left Nigeria to come and do my doctoral studies here, essentially the debate there was just blaming the West, blaming the West, blaming the West on almost everything. I remember on my campus the kind of debate that was going on. But then gradually, in my studies, I started realizing that, okay, Africa became independent. Most African countries became independent in the 1960s, except for countries in South Africa like Zimbabwe, Namibia, and South Africa that were delayed, or Mozambique. So we can't continue to just blame colonialism because we can't reverse history. History has already taken place. The important issue now is what can we do for ourselves within the existing constraints, okay? So that was where my mind started changing. And when I came to the University of Minnesota and had one of the first things I ordered was a box of books, and I started reading, and I realized that there's quite a lot of things out there that I was not taught when I was an undergraduate. So I decided to write my doctoral dissertation comparing Malaysia and Nigeria. And part of the reason was just simply that both these countries were colonized, they faced similar development struggles and things like that. But why is it that not only Malaysia, but many Southeast Asian countries have made far more progress? If you say it is because of Africa is backward because of colonialism, it is true, colonialism impacted Africa, but why is it that there are countries that were also colonized but have made relatively significant progress in terms of human development? So at that point, you have to realize that there's probably something apart of just colonialism that would have to explain what is really happening. And so I started paying attention to what is happening within the continent and within Nigeria, because I feel I don't expect that we will wake up one day and some committee of people will sit down somewhere and just say that they will just raise the development of Africa just like that from outside. Africans would have to do that themselves if you look at history. So there's nobody who's going to really do that. I read a lot of the history of the United States, and I'm really impressed by a lot of the struggles that people have gone through. And I wish some of these things would be taught in Africa. But I found out that if you talk about that in Africa, people would think you're too westernized, or this is just Eurocentrism or whatever. No. There are lessons you can learn from somebody, even if you disagree with him or her in some other ways. There are important lessons you can learn, you can adopt, and then when you adopt, you adapt to your own situation so that you can make it really work. So this is where I start feeling very, very ambivalent. So I spent a lot of time reading the history of Western civilization, and when I went to Nigeria for a Carnegie Fellowship, I was very critical of what is happening in Africa, and one of the students started spreading rumors that I was a neo-colonial foreign agent. Okay. It is really interesting. Here in America, people think somebody is too critical of what is happening, and then I went back to my country over. So I didn't know that this student, this is a graduate student, he was spreading this rumor. And then when I came back, I was teaching a course on Africa, and a portion of the course is examining the ideas of Enlightenment scholars. The era of the Enlightenment in Western society was very critical in moving Western civilization from medieval period to the modern period. So I am very interested in that because I want to know that critical moment in the West when there was this kind of shift. What happened? It wasn't easy for the West, okay? So, but many of these Enlightenment scholars said terrible things about Africans. So I devote 1 week to discuss with my students what these Enlightenment scholars think about Africans so that they can understand. Because how you think about another person affects the way you relate to him or her. If I think of you as a full human being with dignity, it would be a matter of serious concern for me in terms of how I treat you, because I can't say I'm entitled to all this and you are down there and feel comfortable unless I come up with some explanation for that to justify why I will have all this, and then you are equally a human being with full dignity like me, and you cannot have those kind of things. So when we were discussing this with the student, I decided to send the material to 150 graduate students that I work with at the University of Jos. So when he read it, I think he was confused that how could I now be critical of the Enlightenment or Enlightenment scholars if I'm a neo-colonial foreign agent? Because it doesn't make sense that now I'm critical of the civilization that sent me there to colonize them or whatever. So then he wrote this general email apologizing to me and to the whole class. He said he's sorry that he separated these rumors, but now he realized. And then he started giving examples of how African leaders themselves or African people have failed themselves. And I think this is very painful, but it's something that we have to admit. Okay, we have to admit there are many areas that I feel African leaders and African people have failed themselves. And until we come to terms with accepting this and doing something about it, I think the whole idea that somebody is going to come from somewhere to just cure the problems of Africa, it's not going to work. I'm a Christian, but I know Pentecostal Christianity is all over Africa, but I once challenged people there. Can you tell me any country that was able to cross the industrial divide through miracle or prayer, just through miracle or prayer? If you can point any book where this happened, I would assign it as a course, a requirement, so that we don't have to do anything. We can just go and be praying and then expecting miracle is just going to transform Africa. The reality is that if you study the history of the development of all countries, people have to sacrifice, people have to struggle. And it's not just sacrificing for now, but a certain generation of leaders or people have to say, we are sacrificing for the future generation. It's not just about just now or something like that, okay? Okay, so with this, giving you context, the title of the paper is Bad Samaritan, 7 Distorted Lessons and Insights for Post-Colonial African Development from the Experiences of the Western World. So, 7 distorted lessons and insights for post-colonial African development. I say distorted because if you really look at the Western experience very, very carefully, there are good lessons that African countries can learn. But unfortunately, this is not the case. I feel sorry for many African universities because if you tell them maybe to learn about the ancient Greeks or the Romans or economic development in the US or the Western world, they will think like it's just kind of like you're imposing some kind of colonial or whatever. But actually, I would argue that given what I have read, if Nigerian or African scholars are very informed about this, they would have been able to argue their case seriously, because if I know your history very, very well, you can't just misrepresent it to me. I can tell you that, no, this is what exactly really happened. But many African leaders are totally ignorant about the history of Western civilization. And so for that reason, many of these experts can go there and just presumably just dictate certain things to them. And then they just embrace it because this is what is in the textbook. So, but before So I divided the paper into several parts. The first part is the Afrocentric inspiration to suspect, discourage, or abandon studying the Western experience because it marginalizes and make peripheral African experience. So what I mean in the first part of the paper is just to say that I'm not totally against it, but there's something we call Eurocentrism. I think you're familiar with that. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so one way for people to counter that in Africa is to talk about Afrocentrism. Mm-hmm. I teach social theory and I say, I don't think this will take you anywhere because as somebody who teaches social theory, if I'm a Eurocentric and you say you're Afrocentric and you're criticizing me, I will just go back and reconfigure my Eurocentrism and adjust it to your... Okay. Yeah. So it's not going to take us anywhere. My opinion is that instead of being Eurocentric or Afrocentric, I don't deny the fact that people are rooted in their history, culture, and identity and all those kind of things, but we should look for something that will synthesize all of us. I don't want to see myself as an African, so African in such a way that when I meet him because he's a white person, I have to start reconfiguring who I am because my initial identity never took into consideration that there are human beings equally with dignity who are different from me. I don't know whether you understand what I mean. So yes. I don't want to be an African to the point where if I meet a Chinese or somebody from another part of the world, because my initial identity never took them into consideration, it was just about just being African, just like this. And so the day I meet them, then I have to start, okay, how do I review the way I'm going to think about this or whatever? I want from the beginning the way I think about myself to be part of a large whole of this shared human race, that there are different human beings and that we should try to construct our identity in such a way that we are part of a more complex whole rather than just this and that. So Afrocentric scholars sometimes will go after you seriously if you don't quote Africans, you don't quote whatever. Like you write something, if you cite Aristotle or Plato, they may be angry with you. Okay, because they are just white people. There was a time I was in the Borders bookstore in the Midway area before they closed it. I was reading a book on Hegel, and one guy, a black guy, came and passed me, and he murmured something, dead white males or something like that. Okay. So I followed him. I said, you think you are radical, but you are actually very conservative in your thinking. You think that because I'm an African, I only have to read what is written by an African. But I was trained in such a way that I can encounter ideas from any part of the world. The important thing is to start by coming up with certain ideas about what makes something to be considered worthy knowledge. That's what you have to begin thinking about. Once you come up with that criteria, whether I am in Brazil or I'm in China or any part of the world, if I encounter the ideas of Confucius or a Bhagavad Gita or whatever, I should be able to say that this is worthy of my attention, irrespective of the fact that it is not produced by an African. Okay? So I told him that I don't see any reason why somebody will tell me that I shouldn't read a book written by a Westerner simply because the person is a Westerner. The important thing is, what is my criteria of what knowledge is? And even if a book is written by an African, if it doesn't satisfy that criteria, I have good reason to say that I don't think I have to support this book because of that, okay? So, but some Afrocentric will challenge you on this. Everything has to be African. So the first thing I did in the paper was just to say that what we really need to do is that, according to one German scholar, Jürgen Habermas, there are all knowledge has human interests. And there are three of them. Human interest means any knowledge you acquire, there's a human interest that is behind or motivating people to pursue that knowledge. Whether you are an African, whether you're a European, Asian, it doesn't matter. And there are three of them. One of them is empirical analytic, which means you're concerned with this kind of knowledge that is concerned about prediction and control. This is mainly in the sciences. You want to be able to come up with a certain body of knowledge that can help you predict human behavior. And once you predict it, you can control it. It's used in marketing quite a lot. Many of us do not know all these advertisements on TV are not a vain. They have done some studies behind the scene to see how human mind processes information and all those kind of things. So this is one kind of motivation. Sometimes this can be used for colonialism. I want to understand you, not because I want to help you, but I want to get this knowledge and understanding of your behavior or whatever, so that when I get it, I can use it to control you. Okay? But sometimes that knowledge can also be used for something else, like to help other people. The second type of knowledge or motivation or human interest is historical hermeneutic. This is where the goal of knowledge is to create greater cross-cultural understanding. Okay? So I study his culture because I want to understand, for instance, even though he comes from a different context from me, but how we can increase shared human understanding. And there's a lot of scholarship that is in that respect. People either from the West that have studied other societies and have tried to giving us a very humanized version of what understanding of what those people are really going through or whatever. Anthropology has done quite a lot of that, but there are a lot of disciplines that also do that. But the goal of this kind of knowledge is to create greater cross-cultural hermeneutic understanding among us. And this can be relevant not just between like civilizations or whatever, even within Africa. Sometimes when I look at what is happening in Nigeria, given that I grew up there, I feel like these ethnic groups need to have some understanding of that, because like in one of the ethnic groups, when I was a Fulbright scholar for 1 year last year, so I was in Nigeria. That was the longest time I stayed in Africa or outside the United States since I came. And one person told me that in his ethnic group, the term they used to refer to people who are not members of that ethnic group is people living in the bush. Okay? Okay? People living in the bush. So my point here is like, okay, forget about even the colonialism or whatever. Now it is we here, Africans. So if I think of him as somebody from the bush, that's, language shapes our perception of reality, the way we think. So if my perception, the language I use says you are from the bush, chances are that when I relate to you, I will relate to you accordingly. So my point here is just that there's need to really build knowledge that helps us to really understand our shared human experience. Okay? Yes, in appearance we may look different, but there's in a deeper way, there's a way in which we share certain things as human beings. And then finally, one of the other human interests in pursuing knowledge is emancipation. They call it critical sciences. Critical sciences are concerned about emancipating or liberating people from oppression. The interesting thing about this approach to knowledge is that it always approaches knowledge from the bottom up. So critical sciences will write the history of the United States, for instance, say from the perspective of people who are marginalized. Okay, and when you read history from their perspective, you see that they don't see history the same way that the people at the top really see it, okay? It's something totally different. So there's no one type of history. History can be written from the perspective of people who are up there, and some people triumphalist approach to history. And then history can be written from the bottom up, critical sciences. And the goal is to humanize these people, to liberate them, to contribute to their liberation and emancipation. Okay, so you can see that there are different motivations there. These different approaches are not just a problem of Western people. I would argue that anywhere knowledge is produced, insofar as you go to Africa, and African societies are not egalitarian, they are unequal in nature, this struggle about different motivations for knowledge is equally their problem, not just a problem of Western civilization. So this is one of my critique of Afrocentrism. Because Afrocentrism means if the scholarship is just African, that's okay, there's no problem. No, I don't believe that, okay? I believe that there can be gender bias in African knowledge production, there can be bias in favor of ruling classes, there can be bias in favor of urban people, all those kind of biases can be there. So wherever there is inequality in a society, this can have serious consequences on the quality of knowledge that is produced. To me, this is not a European problem, it's not a Western problem, it's a problem of all human societies that are structured unequally. So that's one of my critique of those people who are Afrocentric, who say that, oh, everything has to be just African. The mere fact that it is written by an African does not automatically give it a free pass, in my view. Okay, and then the second argument I want to make is by another German scholar by name Karl Meinheim. Karl Meinheim is known for his work in the area of what we call sociology of knowledge. There's sociology of urban centers, there's sociology of education, there's sociology of whatever. But now we have another area of sociology that is called sociology of knowledge. In other words, how is knowledge produced? And Meinheim argued that all knowledge in this world is tied to a particular social location. And the location where you are in society shapes what you see. When I teach introduction to sociology, sometimes I tell the students that they should come up with this, they should write this paper and respond to this situation. So you have like 3 or 4 people. One of them is able to climb to the top of the mountain. They are all trying to see something out there. One of them stayed somewhere in the middle, and then the other one is just at the base. He couldn't even climb. So, and they are all honest about what they see. Are they going to be seeing the same thing? Even though they are honest? So sometimes we think like, when people write certain things, there are times when people are dishonest, but there are times when they can be honest. But even with their honesty, they can only tell you what they see at their particular location, okay? So for some people who are way up there, they see something really different and they tell you whatever. The person down there may not be able to see that, and they may disagree, but all of them are honest, okay? So the point is, social location is very, very important. We have to be conscious about that. I never claim that. I think the best thing in my view is for everybody to admit that our knowledge or our education is shaped in many ways by our biography. We can't just claim that we're hanging nowhere in the air in just some kind of empty space. Okay, so to me, this is also relevant in terms of my critique of Afrocentrism, because I don't want African scholars to just think that there's nothing to learn from Western experience, but that just because something is African, it is automatically going to serve all Africans. No, even African people are shaped by a social location in society, where they are located structurally. And then I encountered the work of another scholar called Manthia Diawara, who talks about reverse anthropology, which is again something that I'm using to critique this Eurocentric, Afrocentric approach. Reverse anthropology is this. Traditionally, anthropology is used to study people of non-Western society, okay? That's what anthropology is really known of. And they are presented as primitive, backward, or whatever, okay? So, but reverse anthropology says, mostly it is done by people from developing countries, but they're saying that we are going to use now the same technique that these Europeans who are very powerful and studied us, to study them. So that's what they call it, reverse anthropology, okay? So, for instance, there are times when in traditional African society, people are almost dressed naked. I saw some of this documentary, like in Nubia, you see young women dancing, they're almost naked or whatever, but that's considered primitive. But with reverse anthropology, we can go to the strip clubs in Atlanta and see people dancing. This is civilization now. So you see reverse anthropology. So you study the history or the culture of the West, and you find out that we do a lot of some crazy things. There are times we put earphones where I'm very close to him, but I will never talk to him. This is civilization. Okay, he is a human being like me. But no. There were any discussion. When I came to this country, it was very difficult for me to adjust, because I cannot come into a room or something like that without acknowledging somebody sitting close to me or say hello or hi or whatever. But somebody can come and sit close to you. And you think that there's something personal about it, but it's just, okay. So reverse anthropology tries to point out that you cannot idealize any kind of life, because when somebody uses another frame to analyze it, it looks really strange, okay? That people can pay money to go and watch women dancing almost naked or whatever in a strip club, but that's civilization. If it happened in Africa, however, that's primitive. Easier. So reverse anthropology can help us understand that all these contradictions sometimes that are used to impose a certain meaning on other people. And then from there, now I go to the 7 mainstream ideas that challenge Western mainstream economic orthodoxy. These are the 7 lessons. So the first lesson here is the idea of the infant industry. I don't know whether you know infant industry, like industries that are just starting. They are not really mature or whatever. The interesting thing about that is that because of the arguments about free trade, if you go, the IMF and the World Bank has imposed on Africa this idea, not only Africa, actually, Latin America, whatever, that markets should be open. There should be free movement of goods and services, okay? In theory, that sounds really nice. And in principle, There's nothing bad about that. But, and this is where I'm beginning to get into my point, that if Africans have really studied the history of Western societies really very well, they can make life difficult for many of these economic policy makers that can just impose certain ideas on them. So Alexander Hamilton was the first Secretary of the Treasury, I think Secretary of the Treasury or whatever, of the United States, okay? So he wrote a book. If you read the history, he wrote a report challenging Adam Smith. Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations in 1776, where he talked about free trade or whatever. That is considered like the Bible of capitalism, because that's where the initial argument about this free trade and whatever was made by Adam Smith. So, but Alexander Hamilton, who was then the US Secretary of the Treasury, and there's something interesting about him. Among all the founding fathers, he was the only guy that was not born in this country. He was born in the Caribbean, and then he came here to school at King's College, now Columbia University. But then when the revolution started, he joined them, and he was so brilliant that George Washington made him to be his personal assistant or whatever. Very fascinating guy, actually, okay? So, but he wrote this report challenging Adam Smith. He said, free trade is good in the long run, and if all the countries are more or less at the same level of development, okay? Now, he was writing in terms of the United States, because he said, if the United States in 1776, when Adam Smith wrote his book, 1776 was just when American Revolution was really taking place. America was then an agricultural society. America did not become really an industrial society until after the Civil War, which means at the end of the 19th century, okay? So he said, based on Adam Smith's argument, strictly on the division of labor, the United States would have remained an agricultural society at that time, because that is the comparative advantage of the United States agriculture. US was not industrialized. So US would have been a periphery. But he warned the United States at that time, saying that if we were not to industrialize, because we can just produce, we specialize in producing agricultural products, we can export them to Europe, and then we can buy industrial or manufactured products. What if there's a war between us and them or something like that, and they decide to use their power to punish us? We're not going to send you the manufactured goods anymore. And you can't just overnight start manufacturing goods, okay? And interestingly, in the War of 1812, Alexander Hamilton was proved right, because there was a war of 1812, and immediately there it became very clear that the European countries could punish the United States by not exporting certain things, and the US did not. If the United States did not have the capacity to produce those things, the US would be marginalized. Okay? So that's an argument, a debate within the United States, but it's very, very relevant, because what the United States was to Europe then is what African countries are too, okay? So my point is, if you study the history of Western societies, you can draw argument from there. So and then the idea of infant industry was that he said that if the United States did not protect the small industries that were emerging, they will never grow to the point where they can compete with developed Western industries, okay? So that's what we mean by protection against infant industry. So the World Bank and the IMF went and told third world countries that they should do away with all those kind of things, protection, okay? And what happened? Often what happens is we take our products, we wipe out the market for these local produced goods, and the chances for local production is no more possible in many of these developing countries, because they cannot compete with sophisticated products. Even rice, the rice that is exported to Haiti, for instance, Haitian farmers, I have a documentary film in the office where wipe out of the market because they cannot compete with American rice, which is subsidized by us here. We subsidize our farmers, so our farmers are able to export that and make huge profit because they don't pay the full price. I don't want to get into that, but it just shows you some of the complications of this. So my first argument here is just the infant industry argument, and you can draw that from the work of Alexander Hamilton, which is a rationale that no country can develop and compete if it is a developing country without having some protection for its initial industry. If you want to understand what I'm really talking about, what is really happening sometimes when you look at this developmentally is like, you have somebody who is like in, say, elementary school, say grade 6. Instead of allowing him to really evolve based on their stage of learning or whatever, you're trying to impose what a PhD holder is learning on them. This is what some of these developing countries are experiencing. When we develop our technology in the West, no technology is neutral. Technology is always having a social content in it. We develop technology in the West because we want to solve particular social problems here. In the West now, our major problem is the cost of labor. Cost of labor, we want to reduce it, okay? So when we manufacture technology there, our goal is to get a technology that will reduce the cost of labor. But in many developing countries, they have high unemployment. So when you take this technology there, you worsen the problem of unemployment. You understand the point I'm trying to make? So they are at a different, I'm not saying that technology is totally bad, but you have to look at the context. If you don't understand the context very well, you can just complicate people's problems. Okay, the second point is economic theory evades direct moral questions. If you look at the debate we are having here today in the United States, we avoid moral questions. There was a time when our leaders probably would resort to such a moral argument, but today they all only talk about incentivize, incentives, right? Incentivize means now, I'm not going to talk about your morality or anything. I'll just create some conditions that will incentivize you to do something. We don't care what your morality is. So we'll move away from the moral question. But the point here is that you cannot talk about industrialization or development without bringing the moral question. All these questions of agriculture that you're already talking about, there are moral questions there, okay? There are things that can go, economically they would be okay. Like, remember Milton Friedman, the University of Chicago? Somebody produced a documentary and just told him that people in Appalachia have suffered very much, even though America has grown in the 1990s or whatever. So why should we have an economic system where some people are really super rich, stinkingly rich, while others are just so marginalized? He just looked at the camera in the documentary. He said, you cannot make an omelette without breaking an egg. And I hope you understand his argument. You cannot make an omelette without breaking an egg. So essentially, some people will have to suffer. That's it. So, this is a terrible thing to say. When I teach, I show these things to the students. They see him saying that there, and it's terrible. Because if you're poor, somebody telling you that, you know the implication. If you're up there, maybe you don't have to worry about it, okay? Okay, so the second point, as I just said, is that economic theory and strategy evades direct questions of morality. And I am concerned about that. I know the argument people like Milton Friedman will make. They will say, he has his morality, I have my morality, everyone has our morality, so whose morality are we going to use? But can we have a society and talk about economic development, distribution, and all those kind of things, and totally ignore the question of ethics or morality? I think that's a very dangerous thing. I agree that talking about morality and ethics is a very difficult thing, but I don't want to evade that. I think for me, for instance, in many of my courses, the first assignment I ask the students to submit to me is, come with typewritten answers to these two questions. What does it mean to be human, and what do we owe each other for being human, for merely being human? I don't want to know the race of the person. I don't want to know his ethnicity or her ethnicity. I don't want to know their religion or whatever, or nationality. Just try to answer this question. What does it mean to be human? I just want to know what it means. When you see, how do you differentiate a human being from, say, a monkey or a donkey or something like that? What does it mean to be human, and what do we owe each other for being human? Okay, the third thing is the question of mainstream economic theory and the dominant neoliberal paradigm of thinking about human dignity makes human dignity very fragile. So the kind of economic system we're now practicing today, which is called neoliberal economics, makes human dignity fragile. And what I mean by fragile is, I don't know, is there a marker here that I can... Let me just quickly, let me just explain it. There are 4 ways, okay? I tell students that, yes, the Bible says that we're created in God's image, whatever, and all those kind of things. But I tell them that if you really look at how the American economic system really functions, or capitalism functions in general, there are 4 ways you can be relevant also as a human being, okay? 1 is your human capital, your skill set. In a capitalist economy, nobody will employ you. If it is a strict capitalist economy, nobody will employ you if they do not think you are going to be a value addition to their organization, right? So it's your human capital, your skill. And this is part of the problem we're having in this country today, because traditionally, there are many white people who think they have privilege, but American economy has moved to this information age, whatever, skill-based economy or whatever. So they wake up and they realize that here am I, I'm a white person. Subconsciously, I feel like I have certain rights or privileges or whatever. But now they realize that the economy just doesn't need people like me. Okay? So your skill set is very, very important. When the word human capital was initially used by the professors at the University of Chicago, the Catholic Church objected to that because they said this is a very, very dangerous situation because in the long run, human beings are going to be commodified. So I tell my daughter, my youngest daughter, I tell her that, do you think I've been working in Bethel for the past 20 years because I'm the most handsome black man in the Twin Cities? I said, you're going to mix, you know? I said, no. The day they realized that, I'm not going to be a value addition. Okay? And sometimes in Christian organizations, we do that very well. What will happen if I'm giving you a time mission and say, after much prayer and seeking the face of the Lord? You know, what are you going to say? Okay. So the person has prayed and the Lord has led. You know? So this human capital is very, very important. I tell young people that, I'm sorry to say, but it's not just enough for you to be educated to acquire the relevant skills, but even after you graduate, you have to continue to update those skills. This is how the system really works. If you don't have human capital, I don't think in a strict capitalist economy that is concerned about efficiency, even your brother would employ you and assign you to manage a business that he knows or she knows that you don't have any skill to run the business, because it is essentially like celebrating the failure of the business. The second way you can be relevant as a human being apart from human capital is your purchasing power, effective purchasing power. You see, one of the problems we are going through in the 21st century is that even though traditionally in modern Western civilization we emphasize citizenship, but we are now shifting to a situation where a effective consumer status with effective purchasing power gives you more voice than just being a citizen. What do I mean by that? So it's now after 3. There are many Americans, okay, who believe in the Declaration of Independence, the American Constitution, or everything in one, okay? But they haven't gotten lunch up to now, okay? But they're American citizens. Some of them are white, some of them are whatever. I live in the Midway area and I encounter a lot of these people. They ask you for $1 and you wonder, if I give this person $1, what difference does it make? Because tomorrow you're going to find him or her there, okay? So these are citizens of the United States. There's no controversy about that. But there are people who are not citizens of this country who would arrive at the Minneapolis-St. Paul airport right now, but because they have the money to spend, the consumer status, they will be driven probably in a Rolls Royce to a hotel. They will be treated like anything, because in America we don't discriminate between the dollars spent by visitors or immigrants and the dollars spent by if you have, it's not a forged dollar, you didn't steal it, it will work, okay? So my point is, if you have money, effective purchasing power, you have more voice in this capitalist economy that we live in than just being a citizen. You can be a citizen and go hungry, okay? But you can be a visitor. If you haven't broken the law in this country or anything, and you have the money to spend, you can go to the most expensive whatever hotel and eat or whatever, okay? So this is the second way you can be relevant. And if you have money to spend, if you go to Best Buy, they smile at you. They don't smile at you because they are concerned about your humanity. But they know that people like you have the effective purchasing power. Effective purchasing power means if they ignore people like you, if you have the money, you can go to another alternative store and spend your money there. You understand? And their market share is going to reduce. So that's the second way you can be relevant. The third way you can be relevant in this capitalist economy is to produce something of value to the system. If you produce something of value to the system, you are going to be relevant. The day you do not produce it, everybody will be worried. Like if you are an African country, maybe people will start going on the map, okay, what is the country? Because otherwise they don't care about the country, except because you produce something that is so critical to the function of the system, and because that thing is no more produced, then you are taken seriously. And then the fourth way you can be relevant is being an entrepreneur. In modern capitalist societies such as ours, you can't ignore entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurs are people who see A there, Z there, and then W there, and then they bring them together, and then they produce something new. Our capitalist system is built around that. So these are the 4 ways you can be relevant. You can believe in Jesus, you can believe in any religion, but if you live in a capitalist society and you're not relevant in this way, it's going to be tough. The term they use to describe people who are not relevant in any of these 4 ways is surplus people. surplus. Surplus people means the system can literally function totally ignoring you. Totally. It doesn't care. Okay? Good example. When the earthquake happened in Haiti, over 200 people, 1,000 people died. I told students in the class, go and check the New York stock market and see whether, or Dow Jones, and see whether the value has. No, it doesn't. I'm not saying this because I want to demean the people of Haiti, but what I'm trying to show you is the logic of the system, the way the system really works. So in my country, Nigeria, today, there are if 10,000 people will die, some kind of 10,000 people that are called surplus people, it's not going to affect the shopping centers in Abuja. Because those kind of people were never relevant at all to the system, okay? So this is why I say the human dignity becomes fragile. It becomes fragile because it's all about how you are relevant in the system. If you are not relevant in the system, I'm really sorry. You can be a white person, you can be whatever. And this is the reason why some of the things that we're referring to as neo-Nazi or whatever, some of this frustration you see on TV, much of it has to do with the crisis. There are many American workers that have been ignored. They spend their life sacrificing for this country in the past, but America just moved on and left them behind. I have a lot of those documentaries in my office, and sometimes when I watch them, you just cry because they work very hard, but now we're in a new era of the economy and they're left behind. I think I have 7 things to say, but I think maybe I should stop here. Maybe we can have discussion. I don't want to dominate this.
Keep going.
Oh. There are other things, but let's just have some discussion about that. I don't want to. Thank you.
Yes. Oh. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you.